Ludwig just hosted a game jam, but by the time I realized the game jam had started, 5 days had already passed. I was still able to complete something, and this is how it went.
This year's Game Jam was hosted from the 16th of February to the 26th of February. I only just realized on the 20th of February that the Game Jam was happening. The theme was Ludwig's cat, Coots. Immediately had no idea what to make. I felt lost, and I had to do some serious brainstorming to find any good through line that I could follow. The immediate reaction and most obvious choice seemed to follow with the cat theme, which is what I went with, and most other people did as well. Cats are in general pretty easy to stereotype, and a lot of game ideas can be thought of around a cat. It's almost exactly 5 days left of the jam. I didn't have much choice. I needed to think of something small, even small for a game jam game. So I decided that I should pursue a WarioWare-like compilation of games. I quickly came up with a list of a few easy to make minigame ideas centered around typical cat behavior. First idea I came up with was a minigame about pushing stuff off of a table. This is a pretty normal and very well-known cat behavior, and it's pretty easy to design a game around. The second minigame idea was a game about somehow walking over a keyboard and interrupting work in some kind of way. The third and final game theme was about pulling cables out of whatever. So an easy one would be to pull cables out of a router to disrupt the internet. This fits well since Ludwig is a streamer, and this would be particularly annoying for him. I wasn't going to be able to make a super specific Ludwig-centric cat game, so I instead shifted it to be a more generalized cat game, with some Ludwig interactions sprinkled in to keep with the theme of it being Coots, specifically Ludwig's cat.
First thing I worked on was very much unlike me. I worked on a very polished and nice looking main menu, as I knew that I wanted to focus on a small polished experience since I didn't have much time to make well designed and implemented game mechanics. So the first priority was to have a nice looking menu, which I think I achieved pretty well on the first day after a few hours. The second thing I want to achieve is I wanted to have all of the basic systems needed for a minigame compilation game done on the first day. So the second priority was to make a scene transition system to make nice looking transitions in between these relatively small minigames. I wanted them to be cool and have a very unique look to them, not some standard swipe or fade. Therefore, I thought I should draw a nice looking pixelated cat paw that would work as a transition. And I think the effect came out quite nicely.
That was all I had time for on the first day, but I felt it was good progress for the little time I spent on it. On day 2, I wanted to start working on the first minigame, which I decided to make the throwing stuff off of tables game first. This is because I thought it was among the easier of the minigames, and I felt that I needed to make some progress early to keep the motivation up. It didn't take long for me to get an initial version working, and after I had the very simple mechanics of clicking and dragging to throw stuff off of a table, I shifted towards working on more systems that I thought fundamental for the game. So the first thing I focused on that on the second day was making a settings menu specifically for audio. This is usually the only thing you really need to have settings for in such a small game. And I finished that pretty quickly, and I thought it looks quite nice for the relatively small amount of time I have. These little things quickly build up to make a highly polished game. I also added a small little title card that will show the name of the specific minigame each time the game is started. This was just to add a bit of flair and some extra polish for a very little amount of extra time, but it was well worth it. By the end of the second day, the game looked like this, and I was pretty happy with it. Now I just needed to add more content and the final pieces to fall into place and have a complete game. But at this point, I was confident I was going to finish and have a playable product.
On the third day, I focused on finishing the first game and the settings menu. This was so I could leave them behind and not have to think about them for the rest of the jam. The first thing I added was a timer to show at the top of the screen how long was left of the minigame. It didn't end up keeping this in the final product, but it was a good middle ground for the decision I made later. I made sure that the settings menu was working and added all of the necessary features to it. I also began working on the cable pulling game because I kind of thought that would be the hardest of all of the minigames. so I wanted to get it done as soon as possible, and the third day seemed apt. And I got it mostly working. It was spawning cables at slots, and I could remove them by pulling on them. This was the basics for the minigame, and I was quite happy with having all of that finished so early in the jam.
I began the fourth day by adding some more polish to the cable pulling game. I added the same timer I had added to the throwing game, and I added camera shake to both of the minigames. I also quickly decided that I wanted to change the timer system. So I began by adding an additional counter for a hypothetical amount of stream viewers that can be reduced by pulling out cables. This is to simulate a loss of viewers when having internet issues during a live stream. And I thought this would be better and fit the theme more, with it being specifically Ludwig's cat. Otherwise, the game would be very just general cat themed. I also finished up the game scene loading system by adding a system to play multiple minigames in a set sequence. This is of course necessary for me being able to mix and match games in an order so that there would be a bit more variety throughout the relatively small amount of minigames available at the end of this game. I also updated the router minigame to have more than one spawned cable at the time. Initially I set it to having 2 cables spawn by default so that you didn't have to wait for the next one to be spawned. I then began working on the third minigame, which was a second iteration of the cable pulling game. But this time it involved pulling cables out of a PC. This was more to focus on directly interrupting the gaming session instead of manipulating the internet, as in the router minigame that I made before. All of the mechanics were the same, but in this first iteration I simply copied the router and just changed the scene a bit. I also decided to focus the computer game on lowering Ludwig's chess elo, his ranking on chess.com, since I know that he has been playing a lot of chess in the past. Then, as my final quick change of this day, I added a forced amount of rotation to all of the throwable objects, because previously they were just being sent straight up without any rotation, just following the mouse, which was a bit boring. So I added a set of rotation in the direction you were pulling. I had a little bit of time left after work to work on the project, so I began by working on the initial version of the keyboard walking minigame, where you have to press a series of buttons on a keyboard to gain points by some means. I got the initial version of this working pretty quickly, and it was good enough to add to the game, so I was happy to continue working on it. Added some polish to it, like camera shake, and then continued working on other stuff after having the initial version working. At this point, I had decided to remove the timer UI element from all of the minigames, so I had to create new ones for each of the minigames. And for the destruction of objects and throwing stuff off of tables, I decided that the point total should be calculated by how much damage you've caused to Ludwig's property. So I did this by assigning a point value to each object based on its collider's volume, which I calculated by doing a simple volume by a cube that was based off of the bounds of the collider of each object, which was easy to get and was well worth the effort because I didn't have to manually set a point value for each object that was spawned, and this saved me some time. I also added a particle effect when you throw stuff off of the table, so just to show that things are being destroyed, I added that, and a sound effect and some camera shake. I also added some final polish to the router minigame, and that was just some minor changes, but it did a lot to get a better feel for the minigame. I also added a clicking effect on the mouse in all minigames to show where you are pressing. This was just a bit of an extra addition that didn't do much, but was well worth the effort at the end, I think. This was Friday, and Saturday was going to be the final day I could do the final giant push. I had the whole day to work on it, and I was planning on turning it in at around midnight Saturday. Otherwise, I would have about 2 hours more, because the game jam ends at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, which wasn't really doable for me. So I was going to have it done a lot earlier, which I ended up doing. So I went to bed early that night, and I prepared to do a full day's work. It's the dawn of the final day for me to finish this game jam. I had all of the pieces ready. I just needed to polish and put them together and present the final product to the world. I was confident I could do this with a reasonable amount of time and not being super stressed. The first thing I decided to add was an actual line render to the cable minigames. I'd found a nice implementation of a rope system using the in-engine line renderer systems for Unity. So I decided to copy that implementation with some slight modification. I also added an animation when the cables are spawned to show the cable being connected again. This was just to add some extra polish with not too much work. I also wanted to close the game loop as quickly as possible. So earlier in the day, I added a game end screen that just showed your accumulated score in all of the separate minigames. So it would show you the total cost of all of the stuff you broke and the words per minute you were typing on the keyboard, etc. I also added a words per minute counting system to the keyboard minigame. It doesn't show a UI element of your current words per minute, but it does calculate it to background and adds it to your score at the end. I also decided to spruce up the cables a bit and added a system to randomly select a color from a set of colors so that all the cables are the same color, which would get boring quite quickly. At this point, I was kind of done with the temporary and really annoying 3D models that I had created before with just regular squares. So I installed Pro Builder and made some of my own models for the router and the keyboard keys. I had found an open source public domain computer model that I decided to use because I found it to be a bit better. I added this custom computer model to the computer minigame and I added a bunch of slots. I wanted to simulate a computer with hundreds of connections, and this made it a lot more fun and tended to more efficiently differentiate it from the router minigame, which was extremely similar at this point. I also decided to add an image that would change every few seconds or so to the monitor that is shown in the computer minigame, where I just show a few screenshots from a chess game. This is just to show that it is actually a chess game currently ongoing that you're interrupting, instead of just lowering his score magically while the screen is turned off. I also added a spark particle effect for all of the cable pulling because it added some extra level of polish with little to no actual work being required. I just quickly, in a few minutes, made a nice looking spark particle system and I copied it onto all of the cable prefabs, and I was easily able to implement this in a few minutes, and it added a lot of polish, I think. I also changed the models in all of the other mini games, but they were very minor and I already changed most of them that I didn't like before. But I just finished up all of the remaining ones, the most major one being the keycaps on the keyboard minigame that I made some custom ones in Pro Builder. I also decided when I made the new model for the router minigame that I was going to add a few more slots to that as well. There aren't as many on the computer because it accounts to be kind of realistic, but I added a few more and it just seemed to look a bit nicer and a bit more fun. I then moved on to adding a scrolling background in the background of all of the minigames. It was previously just plain white, which wasn't that fun. And since the main menu had these paw print scrolling background, I thought, why not just add it to all of the other minigames? I added switching images to the typing game, where I previously added it to the computer screens. I'd now added it to the secondary screen of the typing minigame. On the primary screen, I added a text editor that looks a bit like the Google Docs screen, where for each key you press successfully, you type a complete word that is kind of funnily Ludwig themed onto the screen. This is just to show that you're actually making progress in the game. I also added a new key highlighting particle effect instead of the blank white rectangles I had hovering over the keys previously. This was just to remove some of the temporary feel of the whole project. At this stage, I also began adding sound effects to the rest of the game to start getting to really feel solid and add the final touches, as there were only a few hours left of the jam at this point. But since I had a few hours left, I thought the game felt a bit empty, and I wanted to add some more personal flair and focus on the Ludwig part of the game jam. So I decided to add a dialogue box that would pop up with some funny message and an image of Ludwig in a kind of stylized drawing. So I did a screen recording of myself very badly doing a caricature of both Ludwig and Slime, and you are able to receive some comments from them during each of the minigames. And all of the prompts and text that are displayed are themed around the minigame you're playing, so each time you open a minigame you will get some different messages. I added quite a few, actually almost 20 to each of the minigames, so there's a lot of fun things to be discovered. At this point I began working on the final small changes that were needed to get the game over the finish line. I'd added almost everything I wanted at this point, and I was ready to move on and start doing a build. I needed to create a nice looking itch.io page and have the build ready well in time. I wanted to have a web build so that you could play it in the browser. This is very important, especially and most importantly during game jams, because people don't want to have to download a bunch of games to their computer and export a RAR or a zip file. It's a lot of work. So you have to make the process of playing your game and rating your game as easy as possible. And the best and most efficient way of doing this is just to have a web build. They're extremely easy to do in Unity, and it took me a few minutes. I had a few errors, but there were no major issues, and I just continued on afterwards. The final product I'm quite proud of. It's not that fun. It's pretty generic, but I'm pretty happy with it. And the level of polish I reached, even though I only had a little bit of time compared to the rest of the people who had double the amount of time as me, I'm proud of what I've completed. And you can play it now yourself. It's available on my itch page, which is linked down below. You can go there, you can play this game or some of my other games that maybe are a bit more fun. I hope you enjoyed watching my journey, and if you like the video. If not, don't like the video. Bye.